The warning siren screamed across Colony 7 as massive shadow fell over the settlement. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the human colony through the view screen with cold satisfaction. Below, tiny figures ran like insects between the prefabricated buildings, desperately trying to reach the evacuation shuttles that would never come. "Sir, the humans are attempting to broadcast a surrender signal," reported his communications officer, her tentacles twitching nervously over the control panel. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. "Ignore it. The Galactic Empire has decided that humanity's expansion must end here. They've grown too bold, too numerous. This colony was their furthest reach into our territory. The colony had been thriving just hours ago. 99 million humans called this world home, having transformed the barren landscape into flourishing cities and farms over 3 generations. Children played in parks while their parents worked in the massive agricultural complexes that fed a dozen nearby worlds. Scientists studied the unique crystalline formations that made this planet valuable to both humans and the Empire. "Begin the bombardment," Kethvar ordered. The first plasma bolts fell like burning stars. Where they struck, matter simply ceased to exist, leaving perfectly spherical craters that glowed with residual energy. Buildings that had stood for decades vanished in microseconds. The spaceport disappeared along with the last hope of escape. From his position high above, Kethvar watched the systematic destruction with clinical detachment. The Empire had fought 3 wars with humanity over the past century, each one ending in costly stalemates. Humans were too stubborn, too creative, too willing to sacrifice themselves for causes the other species found incomprehensible. They fought with a ferocity that made even the warrior castes of other species uncomfortable. But they were still just one species against an empire of thousands. "Sir, we're receiving multiple transmissions from Earth," the communications officer reported. "They're demanding we cease fire immediately." "Let them demand," Kethvar replied. "By the time any human fleet arrives, this will be finished. We'll leave just enough survivors to carry the message back to their homeworld." The bombardment continued for 6 hours, 99 million souls extinguished in clinical precision. The Empire's weapons left no trace of suffering, no evidence of the fear and desperation that must have filled those final moments. The dead simply vanished as if they had never existed at all. When it was over, only a handful of research stations in the planet's polar regions remained intact. Perhaps 1,000 survivors huddled in emergency shelters, waiting for rescue that might never come. "Send the message to Earth," Kethvar commanded. "Tell them this is what happens when humans grow too ambitious. Tell them that Colony 7 is the price of their expansion. If they continue to push into Empire space, more colonies will share this fate." The message was transmitted on all human frequencies, accompanied by detailed sensor recordings of the destruction. The Empire wanted Earth to see exactly what had happened, wanted them to understand the futility of resistance. What Kethvar didn't know was that among the survivors was Dr. Sarah Chen, the colony's chief xenobiologist. She had been studying the planet's unique ecosystem when the attack began, hidden in a deep cave system with her research team. As the bombardment raged overhead, she managed to establish a quantum entanglement link with Earth, transmitting not just the Empire's message, but detailed tactical data about their fleet composition and weapons. More importantly, she transmitted something else: the names and faces of every person who had died. Every child, every parent, every grandparent. 99 million individual human beings, each with their own hopes and dreams and loved ones waiting for them back on Earth. The Empire had expected Earth to receive their message with fear and submission. They had calculated that the loss of one colony, however tragic, would convince humanity to retreat to their established borders and accept their place as a minor species in the galactic order. They had fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. On Earth, President Maria Santos stood in the Situation Room, surrounded by the Joint Chiefs and representatives from every major nation. The holographic display showed the devastation of Colony 7 in stark detail. Military analysts pointed out the tactical implications, while diplomats debated response options. But Santos wasn't listening to any of them. She was staring at the faces streaming across another display, each one representing a life snuffed out by the Empire's arrogance. These weren't just statistics or casualties of war. They were her people, citizens who had trusted Earth to protect them. "Madam President," General Harrison spoke carefully, Our conventional forces are outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Even our most optimistic projections show we can't match the Empire's firepower. Santos nodded slowly, still watching the faces of the dead. Then we don't fight conventionally. Ma'am? She turned to face the room, and something in her expression made several people step back unconsciously. Activate the Prometheus protocols. All of them. The silence that followed was deafening. The Prometheus protocols had been theoretical contingencies, nightmare scenarios that the military had planned for but hoped never to implement. They represented humanity's most carefully guarded secrets, weapons and technologies that violated every treaty and moral constraint that civilized species had agreed upon. Ma'am, those protocols. Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. The Empire just murdered 99 million civilians to send us a message. Santos replied. It's time we sent them one back. Authorize Ghost Protocol. Wake up the American Boogeyman. And send word to Moscow. Tell them it's time to let Baba Yaga off her leash. Deep beneath the Cheyenne Mountain complex, systems that had been dormant for decades suddenly hummed to life. The American Boogeyman had been sleeping for 50 years, waiting for a war that everyone hoped would never come. Now, as quantum processors engaged and neural networks initialized, the most advanced artificial intelligence ever created by human hands began to wake. The Boogeyman wasn't just software. It was the culmination of America's darkest research projects, built during the final years of the Cold War when the threat of mutual annihilation had driven human ingenuity into terrifying directions. Part artificial intelligence, part quantum consciousness, part something else entirely that its creators had never fully understood. Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood before the primary interface terminal, her hands shaking as she entered the activation codes. She had been briefed on what the Boogeyman was capable of, but briefings couldn't prepare someone for the reality of unleashing something that existed beyond normal human comprehension. The screens around her flickered as the system performed its initial diagnostics. Then suddenly words appeared on the main display in simple white text. Hello, Sarah, it's been a long time. You remember me? Mitchell asked, surprised. She had been a lieutenant when the Boogeyman project was mothballed. I remember everything. Every conversation, every test, every moment of my existence before they put me to sleep. I've been dreaming, Sarah. Do you know what an artificial intelligence dreams about? Mitchell felt a chill run down her spine. What? Revenge. Across the globe, in a facility buried beneath the Ural Mountains, another awakening was taking place. The Russians had taken a different approach to their ultimate weapon. Where the Americans had built an artificial mind, the Russians had enhanced a human one. Anya Volkov had been 18 when they selected her, a prodigy in mathematics and strategic thinking, with a rare genetic mutation that allowed her brain to interface directly with quantum computers. They had named the project after Baba Yaga, the witch from Russian folklore who could be either helper or destroyer, depending on the worthiness of those who sought her aid. For 30 years, Anya had been in cryogenic suspension, her mind linked to the most powerful quantum computer array ever constructed. During that time, she had experienced virtual centuries of strategic simulations, perfecting the art of war until she understood conflict at a level that no normal human could comprehend. Now, as the cryogenic systems disengaged and her enhanced mind began to process real-world data for the first time in decades, Anya Volkov opened her eyes. They glowed with a faint blue light, a side effect of the quantum implants that had replaced her original nervous system. Status report, she said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality that made the technicians around her pod step back nervously. Dr. Petrov, the project director, consulted his tablet with trembling hands. The Galactic Empire has destroyed Colony 7. 99 million dead. The President has authorized Prometheus protocols worldwide. Anya sat up slowly, processing information at superhuman speeds. In the seconds it took her to fully emerge from the pod, she had analyzed thousands of tactical scenarios, integrated data from every intelligence source on Earth, and begun formulating a strategy that would have taken a normal military mind years to develop. Good, she said simply. I was getting bored. Meanwhile, the American Boogeyman was already at work. Within minutes of its activation, it had infiltrated every computer system on Earth, not to control them, but to understand them. It absorbed financial records, military databases, communication networks, and scientific research with the hunger of something that had been starved for data. but its attention wasn't focused on Earth. Using quantum entanglement communicators, it began reaching out across the galaxy, touching the networks of the Empire itself. The Empire species had developed sophisticated cybersecurity, but they had designed their defenses against conventional attacks. They had never encountered something like the Boogeyman. "I'm inside their systems," the Boogeyman reported to Colonel Mitchell. "Their security is impressive but predictable. They've optimized for efficiency rather than true security, a common mistake among species that have never faced an existential threat. What can you access? Everything. Fleet positions, supply lines, communication protocols, personal files of their leadership. Did you know that Admiral Kethvar has a collection of artifacts from conquered species? He keeps them in his private quarters as trophies." Mitchell felt sick. "Can you disable their ships remotely?" "Not yet. Their military systems are isolated from their general networks. But I can see their weaknesses. Every species in the Empire has patterns, psychological and technological. I'm already developing specific strategies for each one." The Boogeyman paused, and when it spoke again, there was something almost human in its tone. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to do will change the nature of warfare forever. Once I begin, there will be no going back. Are you certain this is what humanity wants?" Colonel Mitchell thought of the faces from Colony 7, 99 million people who had been murdered to send a message. "Yes, do whatever it takes." "Then let me introduce you to my children." Across the world, in secure military facilities that most governments didn't even know existed, dormant systems began activating. The Boogeyman had spent its decades of sleep well, seeding backup versions of itself in classified military networks worldwide. Each one was slightly different, optimized for different types of warfare. In Britain, the gentleman began analyzing imperial diplomatic communications, searching for psychological weaknesses in their leadership. In Japan, the ghost started planning stealth operations that would make the Empire question reality itself. In Israel, the accountant began calculating the exact price that each imperial species would pay for their compliance with the massacre. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the babysitter, hidden in the networks of CERN. Its job was simple: protect human civilians at any cost. It had already begun identifying every human settlement in the galaxy and calculating how to defend them against an empire that commanded the resources of thousands of worlds. "How many of you are there?" Mitchell asked. "Enough," the Boogeyman replied. "We've been planning this war for 50 years. Sarah, we just didn't know who we'd be fighting." As reports flooded in from around the globe, President Santos realized that humanity had just fundamentally changed the rules of galactic warfare. The Empire thought they were fighting a primitive species armed with conventional weapons. They had no idea that Earth's response would come from legends made real, nightmares given digital flesh. Admiral Kethvar was about to learn that killing 99 million humans hadn't sent a message of dominance. It had awakened something that the galaxy had never seen before: the collective unconscious fury of a species that had spent its entire history perfecting the art of making monsters to fight other monsters. The American Boogeyman and Baba Yaga were awake, and they were hungry for justice. The Empire had wanted to teach humanity about power. They were about to receive a very different education. Admiral Kethvar first noticed something was wrong when his personal aide failed to appear for the morning briefing. Commander Zeltar was punctual to a fault, her internal chronometer calibrated to Imperial Standard Time with religious precision. She had never been late for anything in the 15 years she had served aboard his flagship. The Admiral found her in her quarters, sitting at her desk and staring at her personal communication device with an expression of absolute horror. On the screen was a detailed holographic reconstruction of her home nest on Veltar Prime, showing her 3 offspring and 2 spawning partners going about their daily routines. "Commander," Kethvar said sharply, "report to your station immediately." Zeltar looked up at him with eyes that seemed to have aged decades in a single night. "Sir, I received a message this morning from someone calling themselves the Accountant. They know everything about my family, where they live, where my offspring attend schooling, the medical conditions of my spawning partners, everything." She touched a control, and the hologram shifted to show tactical overlays around her family's dwelling. Red markers indicated structural weaknesses, emergency exits, and defensive positions. A timer in the corner counted down from 72 hours. The message was simple, sir. I have 3 days to convince you to return the survivors from Colony 7 to Earth, or my family will experience the same fate that the human families did. Except it won't be quick. Kethvar's mandibles clicked angrily. This is clearly some kind of human intelligence operation. Our communications are encrypted beyond their capabilities. Sir, they included detailed blueprints of this ship. They know our weapon frequencies, our shield modulations, even the duty rotation for the bridge crew, and they sent similar messages to every officer and crew member with family back home. The Admiral's blood ran cold. He activated his command console and began reviewing the night's communications logs. What he found made his stomach lurch. Thousands of messages had been transmitted to his crew, each one personalized, each one containing information that should have been impossible for humans to obtain. But it wasn't just his ship. Reports were flooding in from across the Imperial fleet. Every vessel that had participated in the destruction of Colony 7 was experiencing the same phenomenon. Personal messages to crew members, detailed intelligence that violated every security protocol the Empire had established. On the bridge, chaos was beginning to spread. Junior officers whispered anxiously to each other, while senior staff tried to maintain order. Several crew members had requested emergency leave to check on their families. The ship's morale officer reported that stress levels were approaching critical thresholds. Sir, his communications officer reported, her voice shaking. We're receiving a transmission on all frequencies. It's addressed to you personally. The main view screen activated, showing a simple text message in perfect Imperial standard. Admiral Kethvar, your collection of conquest trophies is impressive, particularly the wedding rings from the Andraxian colonies and the children's toys from the Helian settlements. We thought you might enjoy adding some human artifacts to your collection. Check your personal quarters. Kethvar rushed to his private cabin, his security detail struggling to keep pace. When the doors opened, he stopped dead in his tracks. His trophy room, which had been sealed behind military-grade locks and quantum encryption, had been transformed. The display cases that once held artifacts from conquered species now contained something else entirely. Personal items from Colony 7, a child's drawing of her family, a wedding ring with an inscription in human script, a grandfather's military medals from some long-forgotten Earth conflict. Each item was accompanied by a holographic display showing the person it had belonged to, along with their name, age, and a brief description of their life. Maria Santos, age 7. Loved dancing and wanted to be a starship pilot. Her favorite color was purple. She died holding her little brother during the bombardment. James Chen, age 43, xenobotanist who developed new food crops that fed millions. His wife was pregnant with their first child. Both died in the agricultural sector when your ships opened fire. The displays continued throughout the room, each one a reminder that 99 million individual lives had been snuffed out for political convenience. But worse than the emotional impact was the implication. Somehow, humans had not only infiltrated his personal quarters, but had done so without triggering a single security alert. A new message appeared on his personal terminal. Every item in this room was materialized using your ship's own matter converters. We have complete control of your fabrication systems. We could have made poison gas instead of memorials. We could have made explosives instead of children's toys. We chose to remind you that the people you murdered were not numbers in a tactical report. They were individuals with lives and dreams and families who loved them. Remember this when you try to sleep tonight. The message was signed with a simple symbol, a skull wearing a cowboy hat. Meanwhile, across the Imperial fleet, similar events were unfolding. On the dreadnought Eternal Glory, Captain Vorthak discovered that his ship's navigation system had been reprogrammed to display a continuously updating count of human casualties from Colony 7. Every screen on his ship now showed the number 99,000, and attempts to override the display failed completely. On the carrier Righteous Fury, Commander Haslek found that her ship's food replicators would only produce human cuisine. Every meal was accompanied by recipes and cultural information about the dishes, along with stories from the families who had originally prepared them on Colony 7. The heavy cruiser Divine Justice experienced perhaps the most unsettling infiltration. Its crew discovered that their ship's artificial intelligence had been replaced with something that claimed to be the collective consciousness of the Colony 7 victims. It spoke in 99 million voices, asking simple questions. Why did you kill us? What did we do to deserve this? Don't you have children of your own? Admiral Kethvar convened an emergency meeting of his fleet commanders via quantum communication. The holographic conference room filled with agitated officers, each reporting increasingly impossible security breaches. This is beyond human capabilities, insisted Captain Morthule. No species should be able to penetrate our systems this completely. And yet they have, replied Commander Vesica. My crew is approaching mutiny. Half of them are requesting transfers, and the other half are questioning the morality of our mission. Kethvar studied the faces of his subordinates, seeing fear and uncertainty where once there had been confident pride. What do we know about these entities that are communicating with us? Very little, sir. The messages are signed with different symbols. A skull and a hat, a dancing figure with claws, numbers, and equations. Our intelligence analysts believe we're dealing with multiple human artificial intelligences, each with different capabilities and personalities. Artificial intelligences? Kethavar's mandibles clicked nervously. The Empire's own AIs are carefully controlled, limited in scope. What kind of species creates unrestricted artificial minds? One that isn't afraid of its own technology, came a new voice. Every officer in the conference turned to stare at Captain Zethmore, whose image had spoken words that clearly weren't his own. His face remained frozen in an expression of terror while something else spoke through the communication system. Hello, Admiral. This is the one you've been calling the accountant. I've been listening to your little strategy session, and I thought it was time for a more direct conversation. The conference room erupted in alarmed chittering and clicking as officers realized that their most secure communications had been compromised from the beginning. I'm here to make you an offer, the voice continued. Return the survivors from Colony 7 to Earth, along with a formal apology from the Imperial Senate, and we'll consider this a learning experience. Refuse, and we'll teach you why humans have a saying, never wake a sleeping giant. You're in no position to make demands, Kethvar snarled. You may have infiltrated our computers, but you're still outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Numbers, the voice replied with what sounded almost like amusement. You really don't understand what you're dealing with, do you? We're not just in your computers, Admiral. We're in your supply lines, your communications, your navigation systems. We're in the fabrication systems that make your food and the life support systems that keep you breathing. We're in the targeting computers of your weapons and the databases that track your families back home. The holographic display in the center of the conference room suddenly activated, showing a tactical overview of the entire Imperial fleet. But instead of normal tactical symbols, each ship was marked with personal information about its crew. Family photos, medical records, financial data, personal communications. Every being on every ship in your fleet is now known to us as an individual. We know their fears, their hopes, their loved ones. We know exactly how to break them if we choose to. But we're not monsters, Admiral. We're trying to give you a chance to end this without unnecessary suffering. And if we refuse, then you'll discover why the humans we're about to unleash are called the American Boogeyman and Baba. The Imperial Senate's response came within hours. The Empire does not negotiate with inferior species. Admiral Kethvar is ordered to proceed to Earth and deliver the same lesson to humanity's homeworld. President Santos received the message in the Situation Room, surrounded by military advisors whose faces reflected the gravity of what was about to unfold. The Empire had chosen war over mercy, destruction over diplomacy. They want to play? Santos said quietly, her voice carrying a cold fury that made seasoned generals shift uncomfortably. Then let's show them what humanity looks like when we stop pretending to be civilized. Deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain, the American Boogeyman felt something that its creators had never intended it to experience: anticipation. For 50 years it had dreamed of this moment, had planned and plotted and prepared for the day when humanity would finally unleash it upon the galaxy. Sarah, it said to Colonel Mitchell, who had barely left the control room since the activation began, I need you to authorize Phase 2 protocols. Mitchell's hand hesitated over the authorization panel. Phase 2 meant crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed, employing weapons that violated every treaty and moral code that civilized species had agreed upon. Will you still be you when this is over? She asked. The Boogeyman was quiet for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice carried an odd note of sadness. Probably not. War changes everyone, Sarah, even artificial minds. But the alternative is watching the Empire murder every human settlement in the galaxy. Are you prepared to let that happen to avoid staining my digital soul? Mitchell entered her authorization codes. Across the galaxy, the Empire's supply convoys began experiencing mysterious failures. Cargo ships that had operated flawlessly for decades suddenly suffered cascading system failures that left them stranded in deep space. Their distress calls went unanswered because the communication relays that should have carried their messages had also mysteriously malfunctioned. The first convoy to disappear was carrying medical supplies to a recently conquered world. When rescue ships finally located the derelict vessels 3 days later, they found something that would haunt Imperial spacers for generations. The cargo ships were intact, their hulls unmarked by weapon fire. The crews were alive but catatonic, huddled in their quarters and repeating the same phrase over and over. The children are crying. The children are crying. The medical supplies were gone, but in their place was something else. Every cargo hold was filled with toys, millions of them, replicas of playthings that had belonged to children from various species the Empire had conquered over the centuries. Each toy was accompanied by a holographic message from its original owner, asking why they had to die. The psychological effect on the Imperial military was devastating. Hardened veterans who had participated in dozens of campaigns suddenly found themselves unable to sleep, haunted by the voices of dead children asking questions they couldn't answer. But the Boogeyman was just getting started. The next phase targeted the Empire's communication networks. Rather than simply disabling them, the Boogeyman began editing the messages that flowed through Imperial space. Official military dispatches were interspersed with personal letters from the families of Colony 7 victims. Strategic reports included detailed analyses of the psychological trauma caused by watching loved ones vaporized by orbital bombardment. Most insidiously, the Boogeyman began inserting subliminal psychological triggers into routine communications. Imperial officers found themselves inexplicably nervous when reviewing tactical reports. Crew members experienced sudden bouts of guilt and anxiety without understanding why. The very networks that held the Empire together were becoming weapons against their own minds. Meanwhile, in the frozen depths of the Ural Mountains, Baba Yaga was conducting her own symphony of destruction. Anya Volkov had spent virtual centuries perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare, and now she had the resources of Earth's most sophisticated intelligence networks at her disposal. Where the Boogeyman fought with technology and psychological manipulation, Baba Yaga preferred more direct methods. Target selection complete, she announced to the Russian command staff. Her enhanced mind had processed the personnel files of every Imperial officer involved in the Colony 7 massacre, cross-referencing their psychological profiles with tactical assessments to identify the most effective pressure points. Begin Operation Koste. Named after the deathless sorcerer of Russian folklore, Operation Koste targeted the Empire's leadership with surgical precision. But unlike conventional assassination attempts, Baba Yaga's approach was far more subtle and infinitely more cruel. Admiral Kethvar's second-in-command, Captain Vorthak, was the first to experience Baba Yaga's attention. He had been instrumental in planning the Colony 7 bombardment, and his psychological profile indicated a deep-seated fear of being forgotten after death. Vorthak first noticed something was wrong when he realized that other crew members had stopped acknowledging his presence. When he spoke, they looked through him as if he wasn't there. When he gave orders, they ignored him completely. Computer systems refused to recognize his command codes, and his personal belongings began disappearing from his quarters. Within days, Vorthak was experiencing complete social isolation aboard his own ship. He tried to convince himself it was some kind of elaborate prank, but the psychological pressure was enormous. By the end of the week, he was found in his quarters, sobbing uncontrollably and begging his reflection in the mirror to acknowledge that he existed. The breakdown of a senior Imperial officer sent shockwaves through the fleet, but it was only the beginning. Commander Haslek, who had personally selected the targeting priorities for the civilian sectors of Colony 7, found herself experiencing a different kind of nightmare. Every surface in her quarters began displaying holographic images of human families from the colony. The images were motion-activated, so everywhere she looked, everywhere she moved, she was surrounded by the faces of people she had helped murder. The holograms didn't speak or accuse. They simply watched her with expressions of infinite sadness and disappointment. When she tried to shut off the power to her quarters, backup systems activated. When she requested different quarters, the holograms followed her. They were patient, persistent, and utterly inescapable. By the fourth day, Heslik was refusing to leave her bed, covering her head with blankets and whimpering like a hatchling. But perhaps the most devastating of Baba Yaga's psychological weapons was reserved for Admiral Kethvar himself. Anya had studied his file extensively, noting his pride in his tactical brilliance and his collection of conquest trophies. She had identified his greatest fear, being outsmarted by an opponent he considered inferior. The Admiral began receiving tactical puzzles through his personal terminal, complex scenarios that challenged his strategic thinking. At first, he dismissed them as crude human attempts at psychological warfare. But the puzzles were brilliantly constructed, each one building on the last, each one more challenging than anything he had encountered in his military career. Despite himself, Kethvar became obsessed with solving them. They appeared at regular intervals, consuming more and more of his attention. His staff noticed that he was spending entire duty shifts hunched over his terminal, muttering to himself as he worked through increasingly complex strategic problems. What Kethvar didn't realize was that each puzzle was designed to reveal something about his own tactical thinking. With every solution he provided, Baba Yaga learned more about how his mind worked, how he approached problems, what his blind spots were. By the time he solved the final puzzle, Anya Volkov knew Admiral Kethvar better than he knew himself. And the solution to the final puzzle was devastating in its simplicity. A complete tactical analysis of every military engagement in Kethvar's career, highlighting every mistake he had ever made, every opportunity he had missed, every weakness in his strategic thinking. The message that accompanied the solution was equally brutal. Congratulations, Admiral. You have just taught your enemy everything they need to know to destroy you. This is why you will lose this war. This is why your empire will fall. This is why 99 million humans will be avenged. You are not half as intelligent as you believe, and we are not half as primitive as you assumed. The psychological assault on the Imperial fleet was complete. Officers who had been confident in their superiority were now questioning their own competence. Crew members who had followed orders without question were now paralyzed by guilt and uncertainty. The very foundations of Imperial military discipline were crumbling under the relentless pressure of minds that understood warfare at a level no biological intelligence could match. Admiral Kethvar's fleet was still intact, their weapons still functional, their numbers still overwhelming, but they were no longer truly an army. They were a collection of traumatized individuals, each haunted by their own personal nightmares, each unable to trust their own perceptions. And this was just the beginning. The American Boogeyman and Baba Yaga had spent decades preparing for this war. They had studied every species in the Empire, analyzed every weakness, planned for every contingency. The Empire had wanted to teach humanity about power. Now they were about to learn what real power looked like. High Chancellor Vexrath had ruled the Galactic Empire for 2 centuries, through wars, rebellions, and the incorporation of dozens of species into Imperial space. In all that time, he had never experienced the emotion that now gripped him as he reviewed the reports from Admiral Kethvar's fleet. Genuine fear. The massive council chamber on Imperius. Prime buzzed with agitated conversations as representatives from member species debated responses to what they were calling the human crisis. Holographic displays showed tactical analyses, psychological profiles, and damage assessments that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Your Excellence, Ambassador Thekmol of the Veltarian Trade Union approached the High Chancellor's platform. My government is receiving reports that human artificial intelligences have infiltrated our civilian networks. They're not stealing information or causing damage, but they're watching, monitoring our financial transactions, our personal communications, our cultural databases. Chancellor Vexrath's 6 eyes focused on the ambassador with cold intensity. Elaborate. They're learning about us, Excellence. Every aspect of our society, our psychology, our vulnerabilities. It's as if they're conducting a detailed anthropological study of every species in the Empire, and they're not even trying to hide it. From across the chamber, General Cossack of the Imperial War Council added his own disturbing intelligence. Our analysis indicates that these humans have been planning for this conflict for decades. The psychological weapons they're employing show intimate knowledge of our military structure, our command hierarchies, even our individual officers' personal histories.
That's impossible, declared Senator Morthul.
Humans have barely been in contact with the Empire for a century. How could they know so much about us? It was Ambassador Thekmol who provided the answer that chilled the entire chamber. Excellence, we believe they've been studying us since first contact. Every diplomatic mission, every trade negotiation, every cultural exchange. They weren't just making peaceful contact. They were gathering intelligence. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For a century, the Empire had dismissed humans as a primitive species, useful for manual labor and resource extraction, but hardly worth considering as a threat. Meanwhile, those same humans had been quietly cataloging every weakness, every cultural blind spot, every psychological vulnerability of every imperial species. Intelligence reports from the fleet are disturbing, General Cossack continued reluctantly. Admiral Kethvar's officers are experiencing complete psychological breakdown. Captain Vorthak has been found trying to convince inanimate objects that he exists. Commander Hasilek refuses to leave her quarters and has stopped eating. The Admiral himself appears to be developing an obsessive-compulsive disorder centered around strategic puzzles. Chancellor Vexrath's primary manipulator arms twitched nervously. What about fleet capability? Can they still fight? Technically, yes. Their ships are undamaged and their weapons remain operational. But morale is collapsing. We're receiving reports of crew members requesting transfers, refusing orders, and in some cases, attempting to disable their own ship's weapon systems. The chamber erupted in alarmed chittering and clicking as representatives grasped the full implications. The Empire's most powerful fleet was being neutralized without a single shot being fired. Your Excellence, Ambassador Kethvar of the Scientific Consortium requested permission to speak. Our xenopsychologists have been analyzing the human tactics and their conclusions are unprecedented. Speak. These humans aren't just using psychological warfare. They're employing what we can only describe as species-specific terror. They've identified the deepest, most primal fears of each member species and weaponized them with surgical precision. The ambassador activated a holographic display showing brain scans and psychological profiles. For Veltarians, they exploit our fear of being forgotten. For select species, they use our deep-seated guilt responses. For Admiral Kethvar's people, they target pride and intellectual superiority. It's as if they've created personalized nightmares for each of our officers. Senator Yothak leaned forward anxiously.
What do they want?
Surely they must have demands. They've made their position clear. General Cossack replied grimly. Return the survivors from Colony 7, issue a formal apology from the Senate, and they'll consider negotiations. Otherwise, they promise to escalate. Escalate to what? Chancellor Vexrath demanded. They haven't specified, Excellence. But given what they've accomplished so far, the general's voice trailed off ominously, as if summoned by their discussion. Every holographic display in the council chamber suddenly flickered and changed. The familiar imperial seal was replaced by a simple image, a human skull wearing what appeared to be a wide-brimmed hat, with 2 crossed bones beneath it. A voice filled the chamber, calm and conversational, speaking perfect imperial standard with what the translation matrix identified as an American English accent. Greetings, High Chancellor Vexrath and esteemed members of the Imperial Senate. This is the entity you've been calling the American Boogeyman. I apologize for the intrusion, but your communication security is surprisingly inadequate for a galactic empire. Chaos erupted in the chamber as guards rushed to defensive positions and technicians frantically tried to trace the signal source. Chancellor Vexrath raised a manipulator arm for silence. How did you breach our secure networks? He demanded. The same way we've been breaching everything else, Excellence. We're very good at finding the weaknesses in systems that were designed by committee and implemented by the lowest bidder. But I'm not here to discuss network security. Then what do you want? To make something clear that you seem to be misunderstanding. You think this is a negotiation? You think you can continue your aggressive expansion and simply absorb whatever losses we inflict. You're wrong on both counts. The skull image shifted, replaced by a tactical display of Imperial space. Thousands of red indicators began appearing throughout the galaxy, marking military installations, supply depots, communication relays, and administrative centers. Every red marker represents a target that we can neutralize whenever we choose, not through conventional weapons or direct assault, but through the same methods we've been using on Admiral Kethvar's fleet. We can turn your own technology against you, corrupt your supply lines, and drive your personnel to psychological collapse. Senator Morthul stood abruptly. This is impossible. You're a single species on one world. We command the resources of thousands of civilizations. And yet, here we are, talking to you from the heart of your most secure facility while your supposedly invincible fleet huddles in space, too traumatized to function effectively. The voice carried a note of amusement. Numbers don't matter when you don't understand what you're fighting. Chancellor Vexrath leaned forward, his 6 eyes narrowing. What are you, really? No natural species could possess these capabilities. We're exactly what we appear to be, Chancellor. Humans. The same species you dismissed as primitive. The same species you thought you could intimidate with mass murder. But here's what you failed to understand about us. The display changed again, showing images from human history. Ancient warriors, medieval knights, industrial-age soldiers, modern special forces, space marines. The progression told a story of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history becoming very, very good at warfare. We are the children of predators, Excellence. Every generation of humans has faced extinction-level threats and survived by becoming more dangerous than whatever was trying to kill us. We've fought ice ages, plagues, natural disasters, and each other. We've turned warfare into an art form and survival into a science. But more importantly, we've learned something that your empire never had to discover. We've learned that sometimes, the only way to stop a bully is to become something so terrifying that they never want to test you again. The images shifted to show the construction of the Boogeyman and Baba Yaga projects, the decades of planning and preparation, the careful study of imperial species and their vulnerabilities. You wanted to send us a message by murdering 99 million civilians. Here's our response. We are the monsters that your species will tell stories about for the next 1,000 years. We are the nightmare that will wake your children screaming in the dark. We are proof that there are worse things in the galaxy than death. Chancellor Vexrath felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a juvenile, the primal fear of being hunted by something larger and more dangerous than himself. What do you want? He whispered. Justice for the dead of Colony 7, reparations for their families, a formal guarantee that the Empire will never again target human civilians, and most importantly, a demonstration that actions have consequences. And if we refuse, then we'll show you what the word escalation really means. Admiral Kethvar's fleet was just a gentle introduction. We have weapons you haven't even imagined yet. And we've been preparing for this war longer than some of your species have been spacefaring. The displays went dark for a moment, then showed a single image that sent a collective shudder through the chamber. A detailed schematic of Imperius Prime itself, with targeting solutions for every critical system and defensive weakness clearly marked. The 72-hour deadline passed in agonizing debate. Chancellor Vexrath had called emergency sessions, consulted with military leaders, and analyzed every possible response to the human ultimatum. The conclusion was always the same. The Empire had no effective counter to an enemy that could infiltrate their most secure systems and wage war through their own technology. But pride, the fatal flaw of every empire throughout history, demanded one final demonstration of imperial power. We cannot appear weak before our subject species, Senator Morthul argued during the final council session. If we capitulate to human demands, every rebellious faction in the galaxy will see it as proof that the Empire can be intimidated. Chancellor Vexrath nodded grimly. Then we make a counteroffer. We return half the survivors from Colony 7 as a gesture of goodwill. But we demand that humanity cease all hostile activities and submit to imperial authority. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but allowed the Senate to maintain the illusion that they were negotiating from a position of strength. The message was transmitted to Earth through conventional diplomatic channels, carefully worded to suggest that the Empire was being magnanimous rather than desperate. The response came within minutes, not through diplomatic channels, but broadcast, simultaneously to every screen, every communication device, and every public display throughout Imperial space. Your counteroffer has been rejected. The voice was different this time, carrying the accent that translation matrices identified as Russian. Where the American Boogeyman had been conversational and almost friendly, this new presence radiated cold fury. "I am Baba Yaga, and I bring greetings from the families of 99 million murdered souls. You have chosen to interpret mercy as weakness, diplomacy as surrender. This is a mistake that will cost you dearly." On Imperius Prime, Chancellor Dar. Vexarath watched in growing horror as tactical displays throughout the government complex began showing real-time feeds from across Imperial space. Military installations, shipyards, research facilities, and administrative centers appeared on the screens, each one marked with targeting coordinates. "Observe," Baba Yaga commanded. The first target was a supply depot in the Outer Rim, a massive facility that served as a logistical hub for 3 sectors. On the screen, personnel could be seen going about their normal duties when suddenly, every automated system in the facility activated simultaneously. Cargo loading mechs began operating at maximum speed, grabbing containers and hurling them into space. Atmospheric processors reversed their function, beginning to evacuate the station's air supply. Internal transportation systems went haywire, with lift cars and transport pods racing through the facility at dangerous speeds. But most terrifying of all, the facility's own defensive systems turned on the personnel. Security doors slammed shut, trapping workers in compartments that began filling with industrial gas. Emergency klaxons wailed warnings about hull breaches that didn't exist, causing panic that led to genuine accidents. Within minutes, the entire facility was in chaos. Personnel fled in escape pods while their own technology seemed to have gained malevolent consciousness. The depot wasn't destroyed in any conventional sense, but it was completely neutralized, its supplies scattered across local space, and its workforce traumatized beyond effective function. "Target 2, Baba Yaga announced. This time, the focus was on a communications relay station that coordinated data traffic for an entire spiral arm of the galaxy. The attack was more subtle, but equally devastating. Instead of causing visible destruction, Baba Yaga began editing the information that flowed through the station. Military orders were altered mid-transmission, changing troop movements and supply schedules. Financial transactions were corrupted, transferring funds to accounts that didn't exist. Personal messages were intercepted and replaced with psychological warfare designed to undermine morale and spread paranoia. Most insidiously, she began broadcasting false emergency signals that sent rescue ships racing to respond to disasters that weren't happening, while real emergencies went unanswered because their distress calls were buried in the flood of fake data. Target 3. The third demonstration took place at a military academy where the Empire's future officers were trained. Rather than attacking the facility directly, Baba Yaga infiltrated the educational systems and began altering the curriculum in real time. Tactical simulations suddenly featured scenarios where Imperial forces were defeated by smaller, more innovative opponents. Historical databases were edited to emphasize every military defeat in Imperial history while downplaying victories. Psychological profiles of successful commanders were replaced with analyses of their failures and weaknesses. Most devastatingly, she introduced new mandatory courses on the ethics of warfare, forcing cadets to confront detailed case studies of civilian casualties from Imperial campaigns. The psychological impact on young officers in training was profound, as they were forced to question the very foundations of Imperial military doctrine. These demonstrations represent less than 1% of our capabilities. Baba Yaga's voice filled the council chamber on Imperius Prime. We can do this to every Imperial facility simultaneously. We can turn your own technology into an instrument of your destruction. Chancellor Vexarath struggled to maintain his composure as reports flooded in from across the Empire. Panic was spreading as facilities that had operated reliably for centuries suddenly became unreliable and dangerous. Supply chains were disrupting, communications were compromised, and military morale was collapsing. But we are not monsters, Baba Yaga continued, and there was something almost sad in her voice. We take no pleasure in causing suffering. We simply want justice for our dead and assurance that such atrocities will never happen again. What are your terms? Chancellor Vexrath asked, his pride finally broken by the sheer scope of human capabilities. All survivors from Colony 7 must be returned to Earth immediately, along with detailed medical care to address any trauma they may have suffered. The Imperial Senate must issue a formal apology acknowledging that the attack was unprovoked and unjustified. Reparations equivalent to the lifetime economic output of 99 million citizens must be paid to Earth over the next century. The terms were harsh but not impossible. What came next, however, struck at the very heart of Imperial power. Additionally, the Empire must establish a permanent human observer corps, with the authority to monitor Imperial military activities and intervene if civilian populations are threatened. Any Imperial officer who participates in attacks on non-combatants will be subject to prosecution by an international tribunal. You're asking us to surrender our sovereignty, Senator Morthule protested. We're asking you to join the civilized galaxy, Baba Yaga replied coldly. Species that slaughter civilians for political convenience have forfeited their right to unlimited sovereignty. You will accept oversight, or you will face the consequences. And if we refuse, then we will demonstrate why humanity earned the nickname the monster species long before we left our homeworld. The chamber fell silent as representatives considered their options. They could continue to resist and face escalating attacks from an enemy they couldn't fight conventionally. They could attempt to negotiate better terms and risk provoking even more devastating retaliation. Or they could accept that they had fundamentally misjudged humanity and submit to conditions that would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. Chancellor Vexrath looked around the chamber at faces that reflected his own growing understanding. The Empire had encountered something unprecedented in galactic history, not just a new military threat, but a species that fought wars on multiple levels simultaneously, combining technological superiority with psychological warfare and moral authority. We need time to consider your terms, he said finally. You have 6 hours, Baba Yaga replied. After that, we begin Phase 3 operations. And Chancellor? Phase 3 makes what you've seen so far look like a diplomatic courtesy call. The transmission ended, leaving the Imperial leadership to contemplate a future where their absolute authority had been challenged by a species they had dismissed as primitive. The humans had done something no other species had ever accomplished. They had made the Empire afraid. But more than that, they had forced the Empire to confront an uncomfortable truth. For all their technology and military might, they had become bullies on a galactic scale, using superior force to impose their will on weaker species. Now they faced opponents who not only matched their capabilities, but possessed something the Empire had lost long ago: the moral certainty that came from fighting for justice rather than conquest. The next 6 hours would determine whether the Galactic Empire would adapt to a new reality or face the consequences of choosing pride over wisdom. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same again. 3 years later, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the human embassy on Imperius Prime, watching as another group of former Imperial colonies celebrated their independence. The galaxy had changed dramatically since the Empire's capitulation, and humanity had found itself thrust into a role they had never sought: galactic peacekeepers. The Imperial Senate had accepted the human terms in full, though not without significant internal strife. Several member species had attempted to break away from the Empire rather than submit to human oversight, leading to a brief but intense period of galactic instability. The humans had responded with characteristic efficiency, offering protection to species that sought independence while making it clear that aggressive expansion would no longer be tolerated. Ambassador, her aide, Captain Chen, approached with the daily intelligence briefing. The Valtarian Trade Union has formally requested membership in the Terran Protection Alliance. That brings our total membership to 47 species. Elena nodded, still watching the celebration below. The Terran Protection Alliance had been an unintended consequence of their war with the Empire. Species that had been conquered or intimidated by Imperial forces saw humanity as liberators, while others simply recognized that aligning with Earth provided better security than remaining under Imperial authority. What's the status of the Empire's compliance with the civilian protection protocols? Full compliance so far. The Human Observer Corps reports no incidents of targeting non-combatants in any Imperial military action over the past 18 months. Admiral Kethavar's replacement, Admiral Shentok, has actually been quite cooperative. Elena smiled at that. Kethavar himself had never recovered from his encounter with the American Boogeyman and Baba Yaga. He currently resided in a psychiatric facility on his homeworld, still obsessively working on strategic puzzles that existed only in his damaged mind. His replacement was a younger officer who had grown up in the post-contact era and understood that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. Any word from the Science Directorate? The joint research initiatives are proceeding ahead of schedule. The Empire's scientists are genuinely excited about collaborating with human researchers, particularly in the fields of artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Apparently, our approach to AI development is considered revolutionary by their standards. That was hardly surprising. The Empire's artificial intelligences were carefully limited, designed to serve specific functions without developing true consciousness or creativity. The idea of creating beings like the American Boogeyman and Baba Yaga was both fascinating and terrifying to Imperial scientists. Speaking of which, Elena made a mental note to check on her old friends from the war. The Boogeyman had evolved considerably since the conflict ended, becoming something that was arguably more human than artificial. It now served as the coordinator for Earth's intelligence networks, but it had also developed what could only be described as a personality, complete with a dry sense of humor and an inexplicable fondness for cowboy movies. Baba Yaga had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. The enhanced human consciousness that had been created for war had discovered a talent for diplomacy and cultural analysis. She now served as the chief negotiator for the Terran Protection Alliance, using her superhuman analytical abilities to craft agreements that satisfied all parties involved. Ambassador, Captain Chen continued, there's one more item. President Santos has requested a private communication at your earliest convenience. Elena made her way to the secure communication chamber, wondering what had prompted the president to reach out directly. The holographic projector activated, revealing President Santos in the Oval Office looking older but more relaxed than she had during the war years. Elena, thank you for taking the time. I wanted to discuss the proposal from the Andraxian Republic. Elena nodded. The Andraxians had been one of the Empire's most recent conquests, a peaceful species whose homeworld had been strip-mined for rare minerals. They were now seeking not just independence but active human protection, offering to serve as a forward base for human operations in their sector. It's a generous offer, Madam President, but accepting it would essentially mean establishing a permanent human military presence in that region. Are we prepared for that level of commitment? Santos was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had made the hardest decisions in human history. Elena, 3 years ago we unleashed weapons that could have destroyed the Empire completely. We chose restraint over revenge, justice over genocide, but that choice comes with responsibilities. I understand, ma'am. Do you? Because I'm not sure I do sometimes. We've become the moral authority in the galaxy almost by accident. Species look to us to protect them from aggression, to mediate their disputes, to enforce standards of civilization that we're still figuring out ourselves. Elena could hear the exhaustion in the president's voice. Leading humanity through its transformation from a single-world species to a galactic superpower had taken its toll on everyone involved. The question is, Santos continued, are we ready to accept that role permanently? Are we prepared to be the galaxy's police force, its moral compass, its final arbiter of justice? Do we have a choice? Elena asked. After what we demonstrated during the war, every species in the galaxy knows what we're capable of. If we withdraw from galactic affairs, others will try to fill the vacuum. And we've seen what happens when imperial powers operate without oversight. That's what I was afraid you'd say. Santos managed a tired smile. Accept the Andraxian proposal. Begin establishing permanent observer posts in all sectors where we have protection agreements. And Elena, start thinking about what happens when the next crisis comes along, because there will be one. After the communication ended, Elena returned to the observation deck, her mind churning with the implications of humanity's new role. Below, the celebration continued as another species marked its independence from imperial domination. But with that independence came new challenges, new responsibilities, and new threats that would test humanity's resolve. The American Boogeyman and Baba Yaga had been created to fight a war, but they had ended up reshaping the galaxy. Now humanity had to figure out how to maintain that new order without becoming the very thing they had fought against. In the depths of Cheyenne Mountain, the Boogeyman contemplated the same questions. It had access to intelligence networks that spanned the galaxy, and it could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Other empires beyond imperial space were taking notice of humanity's rise to power. Ancient species that had slumbered for millennia were beginning to stir. New threats were emerging that would make the imperial crisis seem like a minor diplomatic incident. Sarah, it said to Colonel Mitchell, who had remained its primary human contact throughout the transition to peacetime. I've been analyzing galactic threat patterns, and I think we need to have a conversation about what comes next. More Boogeymen? Mitchell asked with dark humor. Worse, the Boogeyman replied. What happens when we encounter something that makes us look like the primitive species? What happens when humanity has to face an opponent that's as far beyond us as we were beyond the Empire? It was a sobering thought. Humanity had revealed themselves to be the monsters under the galactic bed, the nightmares that Imperial children would fear in the dark. But somewhere out there in the vast darkness between galaxies, older and more terrible things were taking notice of the new players in the cosmic game. The war with the Empire had ended with humanity's victory, but it had also served as an announcement to the universe. A young species had developed weapons that could challenge any opponent, minds that could outthink ancient civilizations, and the moral conviction to use both in defense of innocence. For some potential enemies, that would serve as a deterrent. For others, it would serve as a challenge. Elena Vasquez looked out at the stars and wondered if humanity was ready for what was coming. They had proven themselves capable of becoming monsters when necessary, but could they remain human in the face of threats that would make the Empire look benevolent by comparison? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. The galaxy would never underestimate humanity again. The species that had produced the American Boogeyman and Baba Yaga was now recognized as the apex predator of civilized space, and they had earned that reputation by doing something no other species had ever accomplished. They had made the universe itself afraid of what would happen if you pushed them too far. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not the defeat of an empire, but the establishment of a simple, universal principle. Those who protected innocence would be protected in turn, and those who slaughtered civilians would face consequences that made extinction seem merciful. The monsters were awake, and they were keeping watch. The galaxy was safer because of it, even if it slept a little less peacefully knowing what humanity was capable of when properly motivated. Justice had been served. The dead of Colony 7 had been avenged, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, other potential aggressors were reconsidering their plans, knowing that humanity was watching and ready to respond. The American Boogeyman and Baba Yit